Over the course of the series, we've covered each level, the Kongs and their animal buddies, the Kremlings and other enemies, as well as touched on some friends and enemies that didn't make the cut. So what else is there to cover? Well, quite a bit actually. For starters, we haven't talked about the music. We haven't looked into any of the glitches or talked about the cheats and secrets. As you may have guessed, this episode is essentially a dumping ground for all the things I want to talk about that didn't fit in anywhere else. Strap in, strap on, and get ready. But not too ready, because if I'm being honest, this episode didn't turn out so hot. This is part 42 of Overthinking Donkey Kong Country. There's no neat way to weave the various topics of this episode together, so I'm just going to power through them all in no particular order. Here we go. I know they each had an entire episode around them, but before we dive into the more obscure stuff, I think I'd like to take another quick look at the bosses. Okay, that's enough. Okay, simply because I feel like I should have included them in the last episode, I'm going to quickly rank them now. There's not much to say about him. Points for originality, points for being kinda scary, but not my thing. Again, points for originality and being kinda scary, and points for doing something kinda different to its smaller counterparts, but it's a bit lackluster. Honestly, my boy's only here because I think he looks cool. Best boss fight in the game, and rightfully so. Gets extra points for actually being a unique character model, as well as having unique assets like the cannonballs and pirate ship tile set. The sad truth is, the bosses are the least interesting thing about this game. They aren't bad by any stretch, but they don't really bring anything to the table either. Luckily, future games rectified this considerably, even if those bosses are quite hit and miss. I know this kinda contradicts what I just said, but I like how the regular enemy but bigger concept was teased for DK64. We had the large armadillo, a large pufferfish, and it looks like we were gonna get a snake boss at some point too. DK64 had a lot of nods to the first DKC, so this would have fit in nicely, I think. I'm always forgetting that this game has cheats, because they don't really seem necessary. I think everyone remembers barrel. B-A-R-R-A-L at the file select screen will get you 50 lives. I feel like everyone knew that code when I was growing up. But there were two more you could enter in a similar way. Derby Day, down A-R-B-Y, down A-Y, to open the music test, and Bad Buddy, B-A down, B up down down Y, to enable free switching during two-player team mode. Basically, any player can hit switch at any time, which seems pretty chaotic to me. There's one more. Down Y, down down Y. This gives you access to the Animal Buddies bonus stages, but it's got to be done during the intro screen when Cranky is cranking his crank. I just realized that kinda spells diddy. Can't believe how long it took for me to notice that. These aren't particularly interesting, but I feel like I had to talk about them at some point. Donkey Kong Country released at a time when codes like this were held in much higher esteem, traded between friends at recess and tried out after school. There was something so cool about cheat codes back then, something weirdly empowering. Games don't have them anymore, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm glad I got to live through the time when they mattered, and I do miss it a little bit. Moving on. Not cheat codes, but definitely kinda sorta cheats. Warp barrels are all over the place in this game. When I was growing up, I was really only aware of 2 in Monkey Mines, but replaying the game for this series, I learned of quite a few that went unnoticed by me throughout the years. There's actually 7 warps in total. The first one is in Mine Cart Carnage, but there are others in Stop and Go Station, Millstone Mayhem, Vulture Culture, Treetop Town, Slipslide Ride, and Trick Track Trek. Some of them are Donkey Kong only, some are timed, some are invisible, and this one's blue. The Game Boy Advance port has a shitload more warp barrels, almost 1 per level, but I don't want to talk about that. There's also a way to skip half the game, which brings us nicely to the next section. There are a ton of glitches in this game. None of them are particularly interesting, but they're all fairly entertaining, and for the purpose of this video, I personally tried to verify each and every one of them. After an embarrassingly long time, I managed to half do 3 of them, and that's it. I'll show you my results for those 3, and for the rest, I'll put links below. The Death Freeze glitch, when done correctly, allows you to control both Kongs simultaneously. Start with both Kongs, let one get hit, grab a DK barrel, throw it, then start select out of the level before it breaks. Jump back into the level. If you're hit by an enemy, the game will freeze. But if the enemy knocks you into a pit, you'll then be able to control both Kongs after first breaking another DK barrel. I can verify the first half, but I couldn't manage to get knocked into a pit, which is a drag because I really wanted to try the glitch in a water level. Apparently the second Kong will walk along the ground underwater. If I had to guess, I'd say that the game's got some kind of internal counter for the Kongs, as in whether or not there's one or two at any given moment, and start selecting out of a level as a DK barrel is breaking confuses it. It's just a guess, but yeah. Infinite lives. Get Diddy to land on Crusher at the exact right frame and place, and he will bounce off him indefinitely, racking up as many lives as you can be fucked staying there to get. This is a cool glitch, if you can get it to work, I guess. I can semi-verify this one, as I landed in the right spot a couple of times, but kept forgetting to hold down the buttons to stay there. Not that you really need it though. Oh, and while we're talking about lives, the counter stops at 99, but the game keeps on internally counting, so you could be stuck at 99 for dozens of deaths. Also, if you've got two characters and one of them gets hit, he can still collect bananas as he runs away. That's not really relevant, but I just didn't know where else to put it. At Mine Cart Carnage, reach the checkpoint, start select out of there, then re-enter the level with B, making sure to hold it after you press it. After the Kongs break out of the barrel, rapidly press Y and B, alternating, and you can jump your way through the level. I can't get it to work beyond 1 or 2 jumps, but that's clearly on me. There are quite a few glitches I couldn't get to work. There's one that totally messes up the color palette of your characters. One that allows you to transform an overturned minecart into a controllable empty cart. And as hinted before, one that allows you to warp from between the first 2 levels and drop in halfway through Orangutan Game, skipping a large chunk of the game. Some of these were patched out after the version 1.0 release, so maybe that's why I couldn't get them to work. At any rate, they're fun to watch and talk about, so if you want to see people more talented than me pull them off, check out the links below. I'll include a list of known glitches in the links too, if you want to try them for yourself. The music is such a huge part of the game that it really deserves its own separate video. I'm sure there's plenty of them online already, so I'll try not to spend too much time on it here. The DKC series is renowned for having incredible music. And I get it, it's an unlikely place to expect transcendent, beautiful, timeless works of art, and it's something that elevates the games themselves, making them into something bigger than they are. Much of this is due to the genius of Dave Wise, but I don't want to do the other composers a disservice. Rareware has always had an insanely talented roster of musicians. Grant Kirkhope, Robin Beanland, Graham Norgate, and Evelyn Fisher have all contributed to the soundtracks of Rare's run of Donkey Kong games, and all of them knocked it out of the park. Evelyn Fisher in particular contributed a significant amount of music to the trilogy, including a stint as lead composer for DKC 3, but doesn't really get the love I feel she deserves. What I want to do here is take a look at David Wise, Evelyn Fisher, and Robin Beanland's compositions, and see what impact they had in shaping the world of Donkey Kong Country, as well as what similarities can be found between each composer's respective tunes. Easiest one to start with is Robin Beanland. He contributed the song Funky's Fugue to DKC, which was actually written with Killer Instinct in mind. It fits the game, it fits Funky, and it contributes quite a bit to the overall feel of the soundtrack. Good job, Robin, you get a gold star. Speaking of Killer Instinct, I've been listening to various soundtracks while writing the last chunk of Donkey Kong December videos, and Killer Instinct 1 and 2 are the most recent ones I've played. They're ridiculously good, super intense, super 90s. Definitely worth a listen. I'll link them in the description below. The rest of the soundtrack is mostly David Wise, with Evelyn Fisher contributing the overworld theme, Simian Segway, and the level themes for the Ruins, Forest, Snow, Treetop Town, and Ice Cape. She also did Candy's theme and something called K. Rool's Cacophony, which might be the Game Over music, but I wouldn't know because I never lose. It's actually a really nice addition to the soundtrack. Gold star for Evelyn too. Right away, I can see a distinct difference between her work and David's. Evelyn goes for a more subdued, ambient approach, most noticeable in Voices of the Temple, Northern Hemispheres, and to a lesser extent, Forest Frenzy. It's more about building suspense or tension than anything melodic. Take a look at Voices of the Temple, for example. It starts with a simple drum pattern, then slowly builds up all these clashing rhythms that math together to give the song this constant fluctuation of tension and release. She also has a tendency to favor more jazzy compositions, with prominent bass lines. Simian Segway and Treetop Rock have a lot in common with her work on DKC3. Ice Cave Chant is a bit of an outlier here, as you could be forgiven for thinking it's a David Wise jam. She actually contributed the Ice Level track to DKC2 as well. As far as I know, she's the only person to have music featured on that game that isn't David. I saw that in a tweet from David Wise himself. I couldn't find it when I went back to get proof, so just take my word for it, I guess. Evelyn also uses key changes more frequently, which is most noticeable in Treetop Rock and Forest Frenzy. But as great as Robin and Evelyn are, David really is the star of the show. I'd go as far as to say that there probably isn't one single person more directly responsible for the DKC trilogy's enduring reputation than David Wise. He really went above and beyond. Almost all of his tracks are imbued with a sense of urgency and an emotional weight that makes them stick with you long after you're done. His work is generally more melodic than Evelyn's and tends to favour a busier sort of dynamics, as well as looping between distinct sections. I feel this is best shown in his work on DKC2, but it can be seen in songs like DK Island Swing and Fear Factory. Both artists favour the gradual layering of instruments and the repurposing of melodies, moving them up an octave or returning to them but with a different instrument in a later part of the song. The clear centerpiece of the soundtrack is Aquatic Ambience. Even people who haven't played the game are aware of this song. DKC2 has Stickerbush Symphony, but DKC3 lacks any clear standout track. I think the presence of a banger track in DKC3 would have led to people remembering the entire soundtrack more fondly. Shit, I could go on forever about the music, but I think I've said enough for now. If you'd be keen to see me go deeper into the music in another video, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to see me dissect the soundtrack itself and talk through the music theory, production techniques, that sort of thing, let me know too. It's something I've messed with in the past, and if there's a demand for it, I'd be more than happy to put something together. When you finish the game, Cranky Kong shows up and says this. Which led people to believing that if you could do that too, something cool might happen. The Cranky Kong Challenge, as it came to be known, was something spoken of in schoolyards and playgrounds around the world. It seems like everybody had a different idea of what could happen if you succeeded. From unlocking different game modes or worlds or playable characters, to just unlocking the true ending. One intentional but awesome side effect of the speculation around the Cranky Kong Challenge is it led players to look for hidden stuff throughout the series. When Cranky talked about the Great Gerda Grapple level, as well as the slip of the tongue mention of Dixie being in Angry Aztec in the DK64 instruction manual, we half believed we might actually be able to find them. Again, I kinda miss this element of video games. But none of these things were there, and nothing happens when you beat the Cranky Kong Challenge. But that didn't stop people from looking, trying, and speculating. And as it turns out, there was something originally planned for the Cranky Kong Challenge. It would have unlocked a sort of master quest, if you want to go that far, where you'd get to play as Cranky himself. Thing is, Cranky would move super slowly, so it'd be much more difficult getting through the game. There is actually a walking animation for Cranky Kong in the game's files, so there is evidence that this was in consideration at one point during development. If I had to guess, there would have been too many moments throughout the game where it would have been impossible to beat. Things like the various runs in Croctopus Chase, or maybe getting through Stop and Go Station. Still, it's a cool challenge, and one that's fun to attempt if you've got a spare hour and absolutely nothing better to do. Who knows, maybe I'll be doing a video on it in the future. Something like this really deserves its own episode, but for now, I figure it's something I should at least touch on. Following the success of the game, an animated kids show was, somehow, greenlit. As far as I can tell, Rare and Nintendo didn't have anything to do with it, which explains a lot. It's something. It's the first animated series to be primarily animated with motion capture. They used two people, one for movement, one for facial expression. The results are inconsistent. I think that's the best way I can put it. It's also big on music for some reason. Each episode features 2 original tunes, and shit, they're actually really good for the most part. No idea why they put so much energy into the music. Then again, the game's music is pretty dope, so they had a lot to live up to. The aesthetic of the show is wildly different from the game, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why. Characters like Candy and Funky look completely different. Dixie is probably the worst offender here. I can understand changing Candy Kong for the show, but I don't know why they changed Funky and Dixie's designs. They look like arse in this show. A couple things I can give the show props for is characterizing the Kremlings and introducing a bunch of new characters with varying degrees of success. Captain Scurvy, Eddie the Mean Old Yeti, and Kung Fu were pretty cool, but Baby Kong and Bluster Kong weren't great. They were like the Wish versions of Kitty and Swanky. Bluster Kong in particular. I don't hate the idea of an occasionally antagonistic rival Kong, but he was kind of a shit character. What are you gonna do? Like the music, this is something that would really benefit from its own episode, but seeing as I'm probably never gonna do that, I'll link some good videos on the series below. Despite my own feelings on it, it has a cult following and was decently successful for its time, and the argument could be made that it could have influenced certain elements of future games. I'm not gonna make that argument. The show also had a line of action figures, which as far as I can tell was the first real Donkey Kong toy line. It's kind of a drag that they're based on the show and not the games, because the show kinda sorta looks fucking terrible. There, I said it. It also had trading cards. We did eventually get action figures more stylistically in line with DKC, but that was in '99, closer to the release of DK64 than the Super Nintendo games. We also got comics and books. One book for DKC, another for Donkey Kong Land, and a third for DKC2. I actually read the first book while doing research for this episode, and as far as video game tie-ins go, it's actually pretty damn good, even for a kid's book. It organically weaves all the characters and locations into one cohesive story, and gives Rambi and Cranky a bigger role in the adventure. It's not perfect, but fuck man, it's a children's book. Why am I even talking about it? Unfortunately, the comics are in German. There are two, coming out in '95 and '96 with the Club Nintendo magazine. The first is simply called Donkey Kong Country, while the second is called Donkey Kong in Banana Day 24, for some reason. The first covers events from the game with a fair dose of creative license. It looks pretty good. The second, however, is fucking insane. It involves the Kongs going to the White House on Christmas Eve to talk to the president about the sudden cold snap the world's going through, which happens to be caused by aliens dragging the Earth out of orbit. Santa Claus shows up and Cranky cheats on his wife. Imagine if we got a game like that. Holy shit, why didn't we? There was also a Donkey Kong Country manga that covered the events of the trilogy. It was followed up by a couple of other ones too, but that's getting a bit far out of our wheelhouse. They actually look pretty good. They're very much that cutesy manga look as opposed to the Rareware style, but it works. Finally, there was a one-off magazine released called the Donkey Kong Jungle Action Special, which was a collection of short comics based on the characters and events of the game, plus some other cool stuff like a retrospective of the Donkey Kong arcade game and a preview of the upcoming Donkey Kong Land. I only just found out about this while researching for this episode, and it sounds really cool. Also, I can't find them anywhere and hate myself for having it on my search history, but when I was like 7 years old, I got 3 pairs of Donkey Kong underwear for Christmas, and they were fucking awesome. I remember one of them had DK and Diddy in the Mine Cart, but that's all I can recall. In the last episode, you might remember me talking about the various places certain enemies could be from, or at least the animals they're based on. Here's why. I think we can use that info to determine, roughly, where Donkey Kong Island is located on Earth. It's all speculation, there's plenty of contradicting information, and at the end of the day, none of this matters, but I did my best. This is easily the most unhinged thing I've ever done on this channel. Okay, let's get some broad strokes on the canvas to start with. It's likely in a tropical region, so that already narrows it down considerably. We'll play it a bit fast and loose with that limitation though, and not rule out non-tropical regions completely, but we will narrow the scope a bit. Nowhere too far north or south. Second, we'll make the assumption that DK Island's diverse environmental biomes is less a result of its place geographically and more due to its range in altitudes. What I mean by that is, similar to how Australia and New Zealand can have snow in certain areas, despite being below the equator and generally fairly warm, DK Island's more extreme climates shouldn't be taken as hard evidence against its core climate. That's a terrible sentence, but you get me. To me, it's fairly obvious that the island is in the tropics, and the snow and ice of Gorilla Glacier is due to the sheer elevation rather than being at a high latitude point. That's a fairly common thing, so it isn't reaching too much. Same goes for the pine trees of Vine Valley. I'm chalking Vine Valley's forest region mostly up to elevation again, But it is worth noting that while palm trees can grow in tropical regions, they're much rarer below the equator, so that narrows the range a bit. And finally, one of the first things we covered in this series could hold the key to the location of the island. At the outset, monsoon season is fast approaching DK Island. We know monsoon season is something that generally takes place close to the equator, but for whatever reason, it's not evenly distributed. To show you what I mean, here's a map of where monsoon season hits. Now again, I'm far from an expert here, but playing it fast and loose as we are, that already gives us a real good idea of some potential locations of DK Island. Now let's look at the island's inhabitants and see what they can teach us. The animals are a bit varied in their locations, but we'll see what we can do with them. The red-headed vulture is found here. It's an easy one to discard, except for the fact that it fits nicely into the ranges we've established, and their habitat should be given a touch more weight due to the importance of the neckies on the island. I'm kinda ruling out the seven-banded armadillo and the Arizona coral snake. Armadillos are found in South America and coral snakes are South and Central America, as well as the lower end of North America, with the Arizona coral snake having a pretty obviously small habitat range. Beavers come in two forms, American and Eurasian. I mean, there's probably subvariants in other forms or whatever, but at this point, I honestly can't be fucked researching beavers. While they seem slightly more like American beavers than European or Eurasian to me, I also didn't really put a lot of effort into that conclusion. American beavers are literally just found in America, while the Eurasian beavers can be found here. I did a shit job of illustrating their real range, but that's the gist of it. Ignore the bits in the water. We can't really learn much about this, and I'm tempted to call them an outlier, if not for the fact that there's quite a few of them on the island, including two bosses and the millstone naughties in both temples. Which begs the question, how do we determine what animals should be outliers and what aren't? It's very easy to narrow down the location of the island when you're cherry picking your data, but is that how real discoveries are made? That said, I'm ruling out the various potential wasp species because those fuckers are sort of everywhere. Speaking of cherry picking, I realized something while making this segment. The Kremlings really shouldn't be factored into the equation. Yeah, they might have been on the island many years ago, but who knows if all the Kremlin crew are descendants of the exiles, or if some are descendants and others just joined up later on. At any rate, we'll take a cursory look at some of the crocodile species and their ranges to see what we can make of it. In the last episode, I said some of the Kremling species could have been influenced by alligators and caimans, and while that's true, I think they're crocodiles, so I won't be looking at the habitat ranges of alligators for this. I'm mostly basing that off of two things. The name of Crocodile Isle and the fact that I don't want to do any extra work. The Nile crocodiles can be found here. I don't give this a lot of weight because I feel it's really only Clump that's potentially based on it, but still, it helps fill in the picture a bit. The New Guinea croc can be found here. I give this a bit more weight because in the last video, I theorized that it could be the base croc for the critter design. And critter being the main Kremling variant, the habitat of its real-world counterpart should have the most sway out of any of the crocs. I know I said we weren't factoring in the alligators, but since I feel like they might have influenced the design of the critters too, the Chinese alligator is found here. Now, if you triangulate between the three habitats, you learn absolutely nothing, so fuck it. Factoring in the ape's habitat is, funnily enough, a massive spanner in the works. On one hand, they're probably the creatures with the most weight over the result, but on the other, they're the outlier, far away from the rest of the other island's inhabitants. While primates, excluding humans for obvious reasons, can be found over a much larger and more diverse range, I think it's important that we focus on the great apes in particular. We've got gorillas, chimps, and orangutans on the island, so yeah. We'll start with gorillas. Their range is surprisingly small, with the majority of them being in the center of Africa. Western lowland gorillas are the only ones that are reliably mapped along any coastline, though other maps say other gorilla species also inhabit the western coast of the continent. Chimps can be found in the same spot, but also here along the upper western coast. This is good because it sits in the monsoon zone. I think the chimps are a day late and a buck short here, but if the area east of northern Africa was considered, it brings the coral snake and seven-banded armadillo's habitats back into consideration. I don't think that's where DK Island is though. There are two different orangutans, Sumatran orangutans and Bornean orangutans. This map is very poorly defined, but both of them are basically here. Does the orangutan's geographical location hold more weight than either of the other great apes? No, but like a piece in an unfinished puzzle, it'll all make sense when it's done. Let's look at the last group. Believe it or not, I think we can actually learn more from the aquatic enemies than we can from almost any other. They're not constrained by land, so if they're found somewhere, it's because that's where they're found. Great sentence. Piranhas are only found in South America, which is a huge outlier that I'm totally fine throwing out, because from what we've established in the previous episode, they were a very late addition to the game, so fuck 'em. I'm also going to rule out squids and jellyfish. Squidge is supposedly a squid, but I feel it looks more like a jellyfish. Both are found in coastal regions around the world, which doesn't help us at all, so fuck 'em. Tiger sharks actually help us out a lot. They can be found in these waters here. In short, tropical and subtropical, mostly coastal, but a whole lot of open water in the Pacific and to a lesser extent, Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Cross-reference that with the blue-ringed octopus, which inhabits these waters here, and you can rule out the open ocean in the Pacific, as well as much of the coastal stuff. I don't put a whole lot of stock in these maps, but the giant clam can be found in these waters. I'm fairly confident that Clambo is based on the giant clam, based purely on the visual similarities alone. And the maps are good, it's just that my ability to read them and discern which is the best representation of what I was looking for is in question. At any rate, this looks to be a pretty safe map of their habitat range, but let's not put too much weight on it. So after all that, where's the island? Let's break it down into order of importance. First, this area within the tropics cross-referenced with the monsoon map. Right there, we've narrowed it down to a small section off the west coast of Africa, a decent chunk off the coast of the east, the waters south of India, and pretty much all of Southeast Asia. Being Donkey Kong Island, it makes sense to first look at the ranges of the great apes. The gorilla and chimp habitats don't help us, as they're mostly inland, and their coastal homes don't fall under the monsoon range. Though the orangutan's habitat, Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, that sort of area, narrows it down considerably. I don't think it's necessarily a done deal just yet though. Next up is the Aquatic Enemies, which cover quite a decent range of ocean. The sweet spots where the three intersect are the waters south of India, and again, pretty much all of Southeast Asia. Doesn't really narrow it down at all, but it does strengthen the idea of the island being near Indonesia. Though throwing the red-headed vulture into the mix puts more weight onto the waters around Malaysia. So using what we've got, and probably leaving out a whole mess of other factors that I'm not smart enough to realize I've missed, I'd say it's a fair assumption that Donkey Kong Island could be in the waters between Malaysia and South Vietnam. Now, one thing that kinda doesn't sit so well with me here is that the only real outlier is the gorillas and chimps. Every other species, even some of the crocs, fit into the region or at least come pretty close. Could it be that the ancestors of the Kongs took this place from the ancestors of the Mankeys? That's a whole other can of worms that I cannot be fucked opening. Not now, not ever. There's a bunch of extra shit in the game's files that we haven't even talked about. Here it is. Guys, I'm tired. So that about wraps it up. This episode is an absolute mess, but I'm glad I got all these misfit topics out of the way. I feel like between this and the rest of the series, we've just about covered everything there is to cover in Donkey Kong Country. Almost everything. And with all that stuff done and dusted, there's nothing stopping us from finally getting around to the climactic battle with King K. Rool on the decks of his ship, the Gangplank Galleon. Nothing, that is, except for the half a dozen recap episodes going over all the shit we've already covered. Don't worry, they're already written and recorded, and I'll be uploading each one the second I'm done putting the footage together. So we're only days away from the end of the show. Thank you all for sticking around. It's been a weird journey, but I'm grateful for all of it. Be good, and I'll see you soon for the recap of Congo Jungle.